The world woke up to silence. On September 16, 2025, Robert Redford, the last golden light of Hollywood, was gone. No press conference, no flashing cameras, no final curtain call. Just the thin air of Utah, a whisper of wind through the pines, and the stillness of a man who had carried the weight of American cinema for more than 6 decades. The news broke like thunder. Headlines screamed across continents. The last giant falls. Film studios paused production. Directors, presidents, and actors who once walked in his shadow flooded the world with tributes. For millions, it felt as if an era had collapsed overnight. A bridge between art and conscience suddenly vanished. Yet what stunned the world wasn't only the loss, but the quiet enormity of what he left behind. Redford's empire stretched far beyond the screen. Sprawling estates hidden in the mountains of Utah, villas along the Pacific, vineyards and art foundations that reshaped generations. His fortune, valued at nearly $250 million, stood as both monument and mystery. But the real shock came from his final wish, handwritten, sealed, and now unsealed. What I built was never mine to keep. Let it serve those who still dream. In that single line lay the essence of a man who had transformed silence into strength and solitude into legacy. Hollywood, built on noise, had lost its most eloquent whisper. And as tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, one truth became clear. Robert Redford's departure wasn't just the death of a legend, it was the closing of a moral compass, the fading of the last flame that had once dared to prove that greatness could be humble, that wealth could have meaning, and that art could still speak truth without shouting. When the shock began to settle, the magnitude of Robert Redford's life unfolded like a hidden script, layer by layer, scene by scene. Behind the Hollywood legend lay a man who had quietly built an empire of art, nature, and endurance. His fortune, estimated at $250 million, was not born from scandal or inheritance, but from a lifetime of work that turned silence into gold. At the heart of it all was Utah, the land he had loved more than fame itself. There, surrounded by snow-capped peaks and whispering forests, stood Sundance, his most personal creation, 5,000 acres of wild beauty transformed into a sanctuary for filmmakers and dreamers. Once mocked as a madman for pouring millions into barren soil, Redford had proved the world wrong. Sundance became both a cultural revolution and a spiritual refuge, a place where art could exist without permission. His will revealed that this land, now worth over $200 million, could never be sold. It must remain untouched, a living monument to truth and creativity. Beyond Utah, he owned a $20 million Adobe-style home in Santa Fe, where he spent his final years painting beside his wife, Sybil Zagars, the woman who brought him peace after decades of loss. Another oceanfront villa in California, valued at $15 million, was left to his 3 surviving children, Shauna, Amy, and Dylan. Inside, every wall held a fragment of his soul, sketches, film stills, and a small jar of Sundance soil. In the garage, 3 vintage cars, a Jaguar XK120, a Porsche 356, and a 1965 Mustang, stood gleaming, each restored by his own hands. Even his Oscar for Ordinary People wasn't displayed in glass. It sat on a weathered desk beside his paintbrushes. Yet the true revelation came not from his possessions, but from how he divided them. 40% of his estate went to his children, 20% to his grandchildren through an education and nature trust, and a staggering 40%, nearly $100 million, to the institutions that carried his spirit. The Redford Foundation, the Sundance Institute, and the Redford Center. These organizations would continue funding environmental films, protecting wilderness, and nurturing thousands of independent voices around the world. To Redford, money was never the measure of success. "Wealth is useless if it doesn't create freedom for others," he once said. Even in death, he refused to let his legacy be confined to numbers. His estate was not a monument to luxury, but a blueprint for purpose, a final lesson from a man who had spent his life proving that greatness isn't what you keep, but what you give away. Robert Redford's wealth was staggering, but what truly defined him was how it was built, brick by brick, film by film, through years of struggle and faith. Before the fame and fortune, there was only a fragile boy from Santa Monica who once believed he might never walk again. Born in 1936 in the shadow of the Great Depression, Redford grew up in a small house where dreams were cheap, and courage was the only inheritance his parents could give. At 10, he was struck by polio, his world reduced to sterile hospital rooms and the sting of disinfectant. "I thought I'd never move again," he later recalled. But his mother, Martha, refused to surrender. Night after night, she massaged his motionless legs until they trembled back to life. That devotion became his first lesson in resilience. Endurance isn't born from triumph. It's carved from deprivation. Yet fate had more trials waiting. When Redford was just 18, his mother went into surgery and never came home. The loss shattered him. He drifted into anger, rebellion, and self-destruction, roaming Los Angeles, chasing danger, nearly losing himself before his father's stern hand pulled him back. He admitted years later, "I was always searching for something I couldn't name." That hunger, that ache for meaning, would follow him forever. After losing a scholarship at the University of Colorado, Redford vanished across Europe, wandering through France and Spain with only a sketchbook and despair for company. He painted to quiet the noise in his head, walked to escape his guilt, and slowly rebuilt himself through color and solitude. "Resilience is rarely loud," he would later say. "It's moving forward when fear gives you every reason to stop." When he returned to New York, he carried no money, but he carried purpose. He studied painting at Pratt Institute, working until exhaustion replaced hunger, and when art could no longer contain his restlessness, he turned to acting. At first, it wasn't inspiration that drove him. It was survival. He enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and began scraping by on small television roles. The Twilight Zone, Perry Mason, Maverick. His first paycheck was $75. After paying rent and food, he had 3 left, but he kept that wrinkled bill in his pocket for years as a reminder of dignity earned through work. Yet even as he fought his way upward, his beauty became a curse. Casting agents dismissed him as too perfect, too polished, too unbelievable. "A gilded cage," he called it. "You're inside, but no one thinks you belong." Then came 1963, and everything changed. On Broadway and Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park, Redford gave the performance that set him free. The audience saw not a handsome face, but a man. Vulnerable, witty, deeply human. Night after night, applause thundered as he imagined his mother's face among the crowd. From that moment, he belonged not to Hollywood, but to history. What followed was a rise so swift it defied gravity. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Way We Were, his name became a synonym for integrity and charm. Studios fought to cast him, critics hailed him as the last true movie star. Yet even then, the boy who had painted through hunger never left him. "Fame," he once confessed, "can be a gilded silence. You speak, but no one really hears you." Redford's legend was born not from glamour, but from fracture. Every triumph carried the echo of loss, his mother's death, the illness of his youth, the ghosts that shaped his strength. He was the rare man who understood that perfection is not power, endurance is. Behind the iconic smile was a survivor who turned pain into purpose, transforming the loneliness of his early life into the quiet conviction that would one day build Sundance. The world saw brilliance, he saw redemption, and that perhaps was the true secret of his empire. Not wealth, not fame, but the unbreakable belief that even from silence, something extraordinary could rise. By the late 1960s, Robert Redford had become more than a star. He was a force that reshaped what Hollywood believed an actor could be. But even as fame surrounded him like a bright cage, he remained haunted by an invisible silence. Success did not erase the scars of his youth. It only cast them in softer light. The public saw glamour, but Redford lived with the weight of fragility, his own and that of those he loved. In 1958, before the world knew his name, he had married Lola Van Wagenen, a woman of grace and quiet strength. Their love was not built on red carpets, but on shared struggle, hand-me-down furniture, and whispered dreams. "Those were the happiest years," he once said, "because we had nothing but each other." Yet life, as it always had, tested him through loss. Their first child, Scott, lived only a few weeks. The grief nearly broke them. Tiny clothes folded away, a nursery left silent, the kind of pain no amount of success could ever heal. Redford carried that wound in secret. "You don't get over it," he admitted later. "You just learn to live around it." But he didn't live around it. He lived inside it. That heartbreak became the hidden pulse behind his most powerful performances. When Ordinary People won him the Academy Award for Best Director in 1981, he dedicated it quietly to his mother and to the son he'd never seen grow up. His art was his grief translated into beauty. Yet tragedy struck again. His second son, James, known as Jamie, was born with liver disease, facing decades of surgeries, transplants, and relentless pain. Through all of it, Redford was there, sometimes on set by day, then flying home at night to sit beside hospital beds, scripts forgotten, whispering strength into his boy's fragile frame. Fame could build kingdoms, but it couldn't buy one more heartbeat. When Jamie passed away in 2020 at 58, Redford was an old man, but the ache was the same. Those who knew him said that loss deepened his humanity, that it stripped away any illusion of grandeur. He moved through life with a quiet reverence, aware that even legends bleed. "The brighter the light," he once told a friend, "the darker the shadow it casts." That understanding shaped the rest of his life. His devotion to environmental causes, his insistence that art serve truth, his decision to invest his fortune in others. And yet, amid all the pain, love endured. Lola stood by him for 27 years through fame, gossip, and distance, until time itself began to erode their bond. In 1985, they parted, not with anger, but with sorrow. "There were no villains," he said softly. "Just two people who loved each other until silence grew louder than love." For Redford, the end of that marriage was not failure. It was another lesson in letting go. Behind every headline and award, he carried a simple truth learned from a lifetime of storms, that strength is not the absence of suffering, but the grace to continue despite it. And so he did, turning loss into purpose, transforming grief into motion, always moving forward through the quiet toward light. In the years that followed his divorce, Robert Redford lived between worlds, fame and solitude, light and shadow. To the public, he remained untouchable, the embodiment of American grace, the face that could sell any film, the legend who had conquered Hollywood without ever seeming to try. But behind that composure lay a man who had grown weary of applause. He once said, "The hardest part of success is surviving it." His life became a mosaic of brilliance and emptiness. Blockbuster films by day, long, quiet nights by the fire in Utah or California, the silence echoing louder than any ovation. And yet, even in that stillness, he never stopped searching for connection. There were women who briefly rekindled the warmth he thought he had lost forever. The passionate spark with Sonia Braga, whose creative energy matched his own, the magnetic chemistry with Lena Olin during the filming of Havana, where fiction blurred into fragile reality, and the gentle steadiness of Kathy O'Rear, the costume designer who soothed his restless spirit when the machinery of fame grew too heavy. But none could quiet the echo left by Lola, the laughter that once filled their home, the small moments of simplicity that no wealth could replace. Jane Fonda, his longtime friend and on-screen partner, once described him as a man who could draw you close but always kept something hidden. That distance was not pride, it was self-preservation. For a man who had buried 2 sons, lost the love of his youth, and watched the closest friends of his life fade away, distance became his armor. Still, Redford's compassion never dimmed. The pain that had once nearly destroyed him became the source of his humanity. Through the Sundance Institute, he funded thousands of artists whose voices would otherwise go unheard. "Art is not about fame," he told a young director. "It's about telling the truth when silence feels safer." That philosophy defined his later years. When Paul Newman, his brother in spirit, and the other half of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid passed away in 2008, Redford spoke only 7 words to the press. "There's a hole in my life now." It was all he needed to say. The world saw stoicism. Those who knew him saw heartbreak. In private, Redford often spoke of ghosts, not with fear, but with reverence. Natalie Wood's laughter, Paul Newman's wisdom, his mother's voice, the tiny heartbeat of his first son, each memory lived in the quiet corners of his soul. "We never really lose people," he once murmured. "We just keep talking to them in our heads, hoping they answer." That was the truth of him. Not the legend, not the fortune, but the man who had endured everything and still chose kindness. He carried grief like a lantern, using it to light the way for others. By the time the world looked at Robert Redford and saw a myth, he had long understood the secret of being human, that love and loss are not opposites, but reflections of the same sacred flame, and he had spent a lifetime keeping it alive. By the late 1990s, Robert Redford had lived through every season of a man's life: fame, loss, triumph, heartbreak. And yet something inside him still ached quietly, a longing for peace that neither fortune nor applause could grant. That peace arrived unexpectedly, like rain after a long drought. Her name was Sibylle Zaggers, a German-born painter whose art spoke in colors, not words. When they met, Redford was 70, a man sculpted by silence and endurance. She was a woman of calm energy, attuned to rhythm, nature, and light. "It felt like stepping out of a storm," he said years later, and realizing the ground still remembers how to hold you. Their connection was unlike anything he had known before. With Sibylle, he found not excitement but stillness, a mirror for his own creative soul. She didn't see the Hollywood icon. She saw the weary artist, the father who had buried 2 sons, the man who had carried too much pain and given too much of himself to a world that never stopped demanding more. Their bond deepened quietly, without spectacle. In 2009, they married in a small ceremony in Hamburg, far from cameras, surrounded only by friends, family, and the sound of rain against glass. "It feels like a new life," Redford told a reporter afterward, a simple sentence hiding half a century of endurance. Together they created something profoundly spiritual, The Way of the Rain, an interdisciplinary performance blending art, music, film, and nature, inspired by the fragility of the earth. Sibylle painted while Redford narrated, his voice deep and deliberate, turning environmental reflection into poetry. To audiences it was art, to them it was confession, a shared act of healing. "We forget," he said softly during one performance, "that what we take from the world, it remembers." For a man who had spent decades building empires of cinema and silence, The Way of the Rain became his redemption song. In Santa Fe, their home became a sanctuary filled with canvases, desert light, and the hum of creation. Redford painted again, something he hadn't done regularly since his youth in Europe. The desert, with its endless horizon, reflected his own spirit. quiet, scarred, resilient. "Out here," he told a friend, "you can hear yourself think again." His mornings were devoted to art and meditation, his evenings to reading or walking with Sibyl under the immense New Mexico sky. There was no need for words. After decades of searching, he had finally found a rhythm that asked for nothing and gave everything: peace, purpose, and forgiveness. For Redford, love in his later years wasn't about passion or possession, it was about presence. "Real love," he once said, "is permission to be, to breathe, to finally stop running." And for the first time in his long and restless life, he stopped. Beneath the same sky that had watched him rise, fall, and rebuild himself countless times, Robert Redford discovered what he had spent a lifetime seeking: not fame, not fortune, but stillness, and in that stillness, grace. In his final years, Robert Redford moved through life with the slow grace of a man who had finally made peace with time. The drive that once propelled him across continents had softened into quiet ritual. Each morning in Santa Fe began with light spilling across the desert floor, a brush in his hand, and Sibyl nearby, painting in silence. His days no longer belonged to studios or sets, but to rhythm. The whisper of the wind, the murmur of rain, the patience of the earth. Friends who visited said he seemed transformed, lighter somehow, as if he had traded the weight of glory for the comfort of stillness. He often spoke of gratitude, not for his fortune, but for the simple fact that after a lifetime of chasing meaning, he had found it waiting in the ordinary. "Fame fades," he told a young filmmaker once. "What remains is what you give back." And give he did, donating millions through his foundations, mentoring new artists, and quietly funding conservation projects in the American West. Yet even as the body aged and his steps slowed, the fire in his mind never dimmed. He remained fiercely engaged with the causes that defined him: truth in storytelling, integrity in art, and respect for the land that had shaped him. By 2025, his health had begun to fail, but he faced it with the same stoic courage that had marked every chapter of his life. He rarely spoke of pain, preferring to discuss the next painting or the next Sundance program that might help a young voice be heard. Then came that September morning in Utah. The air was crisp, the mountains awash in gold. In his home at Sundance, surrounded by the land he had protected for half a century, Redford took one final breath. There were no flashing lights, no cameras, just silence and wind moving through the trees. The news spread within hours, stunning the world. Tributes poured in from filmmakers, world leaders, and artists whose lives had been changed by his example. "He taught us that decency could be revolutionary," one director wrote. But at Sundance there were no speeches. Sibyl sat by the window he loved, his brushes still resting beside an unfinished sketch. The quiet was overwhelming. She touched the chair where he used to read and whispered, "You're still here." His children, Shauna, Amy, and Dylan, returned to Utah, walking the same trails he had once cleared, their grief mingling with pride. They mourned not the legend, but the man, the father who believed that kindness was a form of art. Even in death, Redford's influence rippled outward. His will became his final masterpiece, a living testament to the ideals that had guided him: courage, humility, and stewardship. The Sundance Institute continued to nurture more than 15,000 filmmakers in 80 countries. The Redford Center expanded its reach, producing documentaries that gave voice to the planet he so loved. And in Santa Fe, Sibyl transformed their home into a working studio and gallery, where his paintings and her canvases breathed side by side, a dialogue between light and memory. Visitors said it felt like walking into peace itself. Each year, on the anniversary of his passing, his family screens "The Way of the Rain" beneath the Utah stars, the desert wind carrying his voice across the canyons. What we take from the world, it says softly. It remembers. That remembrance is his immortality. Robert Redford began as a boy who could barely walk and ended as a man who helped generations learn to stand taller. He built empires not of power, but of purpose, leaving behind not monuments of stone, but legacies of conscience. His wealth remains vast, his influence immeasurable. But his greatest fortune was the serenity he earned at the end. In the hush of Sundance, where pine trees sway and rivers sing, one can still feel his presence, calm, steady, eternal. And somewhere in that wind, the boy who once feared he would never rise walks again, quietly, into the light. Robert Redford's passing did not mark an ending so much as the beginning of a new chapter written by those who carried his spirit forward. In the months following his death, his family worked quietly to fulfill his final wishes. There were no extravagant memorials, no Hollywood spectacle, only a gathering beneath the Utah sky, where the mountains glowed with the same gold light he had loved all his life. Sybil Zagars stood before friends and family, her voice steady but trembling, reading a letter Redford had written years earlier. "Do not mourn me with silence. Continue the work. Let beauty and truth outlive us both." Those words became a mission. His children, Shauna, Amy, and Dylan, chose to live not in the shadow of his fame, but in the light of his purpose. They expanded the Sundance legacy, turning their father's philosophy into daily practice. Each project they funded carried his fingerprints: environmental restoration, scholarships for filmmakers, programs for indigenous storytellers, and climate awareness campaigns inspired by his lifelong fight for the earth. Meanwhile, Sybil transformed their Santa Fe home into a living gallery, the Way of the Rain Foundation. It became a space where art, film, and music merged into one dialogue between humanity and nature. Visitors from around the world came to see her paintings illuminated beside Redford's sketches and photographs, a union of two souls that continued to speak even after death. "This house is alive with him," she said. "He's in every color I paint." That sentiment echoed far beyond their walls. Hollywood veterans described his absence as a silence too large to fill. Younger artists, many of whom had been supported by his Sundance Institute, called him the architect of modern storytelling. Financially, the magnitude of his legacy stunned even those closest to him. His fortune, carefully distributed through his will, became an engine of change. Nearly $100 million was directed into environmental and artistic endowments, ensuring that thousands of independent creators could continue to thrive long after his passing. His estate in Utah remained untouched, protected as he had decreed. No developers, no commercial projects, just wilderness, open sky, and the echo of his footsteps. The land itself became his monument, more eternal than marble. Years later, journalists would describe Redford as the man who turned stillness into immortality. But to those who knew him, his true wealth was never measured in money or fame. It was in the quiet decency that defined everything he touched. He taught an entire generation that greatness does not roar, it whispers. That art, stripped of ego, can still move the world. His story began with a sick child who refused to surrender and ended with a legacy that refused to fade. Today, the Sundance Film Festival continues to thrive, evolving into one of the world's most vital cultural forces. Each winter, as filmmakers gather beneath the cold Utah sun, his presence lingers in the mountain air. His voice, deep, patient, unwavering, seems to murmur through the snow. Tell the truth, even when it costs you. It is both command and benediction. And each time the lights dim for a premiere, a generation of artists rises to honor that vow. Robert Redford's life was never about spectacle. It was about endurance, grace, and the belief that a single person's integrity can change the course of an art form. He built his empire not from vanity, but from vision, a vision that now belongs to the world. Decades from now, when new dreamers pick up cameras, brushes, or pens, they will still walk the road he paved. For in the end, the boy who once feared he'd never walk again taught us all how to keep moving, quietly, courageously, and forever toward the light. Even years after his death, the echo of Robert Redford's presence continued to ripple through the world of art and humanity. What he had built refused to fade. In Utah, Sundance became more than a festival. It was a living cathedral of independent thought. Each January, young filmmakers gathered beneath the snow-capped mountains to honor his vision. They spoke of him not as a star, but as a mentor who had shown that art could exist without compromise. His philosophy, truth over perfection, courage over comfort, was engraved at the entrance to the main theater. Every film screened there, every debut, every trembling speech under the spotlight felt like a silent conversation with the man who had once dared to believe that cinema could change the world. And perhaps it did. Beyond the screens and accolades, Redford's influence reached into the soil itself. Through the Redford Center and his environmental foundations, thousands of projects bloomed, reforesting acres, cleaning rivers, protecting wildlife, and teaching children that the earth was not a resource but a relative. His family, now guardians of that legacy, moved with his same quiet determination. Shauna, the painter, Amy, the filmmaker, Dylan, the writer, each carried a fragment of their father's vision, continuing the dialogue between art and conscience. In Santa Fe, Sibyle kept their home alive as both gallery and shrine. On quiet afternoons, she would play old recordings of his voice, narrating the way of the rain, and paint while listening, her brush gliding to the rhythm of words once spoken by love. "He hasn't left," she told visitors softly. "He's just become part of the light." Financial analysts marveled at how precisely Redford had crafted his will, transforming wealth into sustainability. The $250 million he left behind did not sit still. It moved. It flowed through institutions, scholarships, and environmental trusts, all carefully structured to last centuries, not years. Every dollar had purpose. Every acre was preserved. Even his vintage cars and watches, once symbols of craft, became heirlooms with handwritten notes for his grandchildren. Don't measure time, make it count. But perhaps the truest continuation of Redford's spirit lived not in the money, the land, or the art, but in the stories people told. Crew members remembered his humility, how he'd eat with electricians on set rather than retreat to trailers. Directors spoke of his quiet authority, the way he could correct a scene with one sentence, and countless young artists, those who had once received a small grant or encouraging letter from him, now stood on their own stages, carrying his message forward. He had taught them that success was not measured in applause, but in endurance. At Sundance today, when the final film of the festival ends and the crowd rises to its feet, there's a tradition. The lights dim, the wind outside hums against the mountains, and his image appears briefly on the screen. Young, determined, eyes bright with belief. No words, just the sound of rain. And then a line fades in. What we take from the world, it remembers. In that moment, every voice in the theater falls silent. Because they understand. They are not just watching the legacy of Robert Redford, they are living in it. He began as a boy who feared he might never walk again, and became a man who taught the world how to move forward, with dignity, with purpose, and with grace. His light endures, vast as the desert, tender as the rain, and in every heart that still believes in beauty without noise, Robert Redford lives on. Even now, when his story has found its gentle ending, Robert Redford still speaks to us, through every film that made us believe, every quiet act of grace that reminded us what humanity can be. His life was not just a journey from struggle to success. It was proof that the heart, when guided by compassion, can outlast time itself. He showed us that fame is fleeting, but kindness endures. That true greatness is not measured by how brightly one shines, but by how softly one gives light to others. His courage to stand for integrity in an industry that often rewards noise over truth should inspire us all to live with more honesty, more purpose, and more tenderness toward the world around us. Today, as we look back on his story, the little boy who fought illness, the man who carried grief with dignity, the artist who gave voice to the unheard, let us take a moment to feel, not just to remember. Let us honor him not with silence, but with empathy. Because Robert Redford's legacy is not made of stone or silver screens. It lives inside each of us who still believes that art can heal, that truth can move mountains, and that love, even after loss, is the most powerful force we have. So if his films ever touched your soul, if his voice ever gave you strength in your own moments of doubt, let that gratitude live on. We invite you to be part of this tribute, to share his story, to keep his light alive. Hit the like button if his courage inspired you. Share this video so others may rediscover the man behind the legend, and subscribe to our channel so together we can continue telling the stories that remind us what truly matters. Every view, every comment, every act of remembrance adds another thread to the fabric of his legacy. Because legends like Robert Redford don't disappear. They live through us, through the kindness we choose, the truths we tell, and the beauty we refuse to stop believing in. May we all, in our own ways, carry forward his lesson, to live quietly, to love deeply, and to never stop creating light in a world that sometimes forgets how much it needs it.